Hi there, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of the advanced features that you can access when you work in the Nodegraph in the Octane integration for Unity. And for this example, I'm using the docking bay scene, which you can see has lots of cool stuff you can play with, including some little robot workers here. So I'm going to create a blank scene within this project and play with the material that's applied to the robot and see what kind of effects we can get when working in the Nodegraph. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I have Octane installed and loaded, which it is. And I'm going to go to the File menu and choose New Scene. New Scene, there we go. We can save this. We have a blank scene here, so I'm going to create a plane. So I'll choose Game Object, 3D Object, Plane. And in the inspector, let's set this to 0 and X, Y, and Z just to get it at the origin, and I'll scale it up a little bit. And in the docking bay folder under assets, I'm going to take the robot worker here and drag him onto the scene and press F to zoom in. Make sure he's standing on top of the plane. There we go. So here he is. And if I select part of the object here, you can see that all the geometry that makes up the robot has this default Lambert shader on it that came in with the FBX. So let's take a look at this. We're going to actually convert this into our Octane material. Before we do anything else, let's do a quick render to see where we're at. Let me zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to go into the Octane menu, open up Viewport, and here it is down here. Then I also need to make sure that I have a PBR render target for this scene. So choose Octane, create PBR render target. Select this and press render. It will compile the scene, and after a few seconds you see here's our robot. Let's take this directional light and maybe rotate it a little bit so that the light is shining at the front of the robot. There we go, get some nice shadows in there. So let's go into the project window here, and under materials, I'm going to find that Lambert 1 shader that's applied to our robot. Here it is right here. And in the inspector, I'm going to set this shader from standard to Octane PBR override. Let's go back to the PBR viewport. You can see it looks white. I'm going to go back to the project window. Let's rename this real quick. So let's call this robot material Octane. And if we want to add a texture to display here within the Unity scene, we can click on this button right here, and this will bring up all the textures for this project. So we can find a nice mechanical looking sort of dirty metallic texture. Dirty metal works pretty well. Turn off shaded wireframe. You can see there's the material as it appears in the Unity scene. We don't see anything down here in Octane because we need to add the textures and then edit the shader in the Nodegraph editor. So if I press this Add Texture button, I'm just going to add a few slots here. And I can click on these circles and add some of these textures. So we have some kind of fun, generic, mechanical looking textures here. So you can see when I click on the texture, you see that it updates the name right here. So let's choose panel 1. I'm going to click on this dot for the second one. Let's add that dirty metal texture. Make sure we can see what's going on. Let's add another panel texture. Click on this. We see we've got panel 7, so let's choose the panel 7 normal to go with that. So now we have some textures that we can play with in the Nodegraph editor. So to open the Nodegraph editor, I'm going to press View Source and pull up the window here. And in the Nodegraph, we can see a copy of the PBR viewport. We also have the editor itself down here, which is a graph style editor, and the node inspector. So if I select one of these textures, you can see here the attributes of that texture in the node inspector. To pan in the Nodegraph editor, you can drag while holding the right mouse button. To zoom in, you can use a scroll wheel on your mouse, and you can also use this little navigator up here to kind of navigate the scene. We have the material out node, which makes a connection between our Octane material and what we see in the PBR viewport. And we have some textures. These are the same textures we just added in the inspector. I'm going to create a few materials here and just take a look at how they behave within Octane. So I'll right click and choose materials, and let's create a glossy material. I'll right click, choose materials. Let's choose a specular material. And then I'm going to right click, materials, diffuse, and then right click, materials, and choose mix. So let's push these off to the side for the moment. And I'm going to take the glossy material and connect it to material out. So glossy material works really well for opaque materials such as metals and plastics. And when I connect it, you don't see a whole lot of a change, but if I go into the node inspector and start to edit the settings, for instance, if I select the diffuse, I'm going to click on this color picker right here and then drag this down, you can see the updates right here. So let's make this kind of a dim blue. We have specularity and roughness. If I increase the roughness, we're going to spread out the highlight on the surface. And also if I increase the index of refraction, we're going to see the surface become shinier and shinier until it becomes kind of like metal. We also have connections for bump, normal, displacement, and other options, which get more advanced, but I just want to kind of take a look at the basics here, mostly about how to work within the node editor. So let's try connecting the panel 7 texture to the diffuse input. Drag it over here and click on the circle on the bottom, drag out a wire, and connect it to the diffuse input. So you can see as I hover over the inputs for the glossy material, you can see that the label of the inputs appears. So I'll connect this to diffuse. I'm going to take our panel 7 normal texture and connect this to normal. I'll select panel normal 7 and let's take the power of this texture and let's bring it down. So you can see the influence of the normal here in the specular highlights. These two textures are based off the same shapes, so they do match. They're currently being projected based on the UVs of the surface. What I like to do is I like to edit their placement on the surface, but if I go in here to panel 7 and it's currently the projection is set to mesh UV, I'm going to set the UV transform to 2D transformation, and then what I can do is I can adjust, say, the rotation and the scale and translation and so on. So if I set that to 0.5, you can see the effect there. What I like to do though is I want to use the same values for both this panel 7 and panel 7 normal so that they match up. So what I can do is right click, use the create menu to create a 2D transform, and then I can connect a wire from the 2D transform to UV transform import on both textures. And this way, if I change the settings of the UV transform node, both textures will update. So for example, if I start to scale this down, both of them will update accordingly. Let's take a look at some of the other materials here. So I'm going to disconnect the glossy material, select all of these, and then just push them out of the way. Let's put the node like over here. And then move this up over here. Let's take a look at the specular material. This is great for doing transparent surfaces like glasses and clear plastic. So I'm going to connect the wire from the specular material to material out. I'm currently using the direct lighting kernel, which is not going to be physically accurate for things like refractions. So let's switch to the path tracing kernel. I can do that in Unity. I can also click on the Scene tab here in the Nodegraph editor and select my PBR render target. And I'm going to select this and then find the kernel settings and set the kernel from direct lighting to, let's say, path tracing. So now we can see this looks a bit more like glass. Let's switch back to this tab and take our specular material. You can see we can change things like the transmission. Let's say I wanted to make this slightly colored. I'll set the transmission to like blue. And then of course we also have a roughness setting. So if I increase this, we're going to get more of the reflection on the surface. It's creating a blurred refraction, which kind of looks like frosted glass, which is kind of a cool effect. And we could also change things like the index of refraction. If I set this down to 1, we're going to get this very translucent kind of surface without much reflective quality. And if I increase this, we'll see it's going to reflect more and more of the environment. And it's also going to refract the light as it passes through the surface more and more. So let's set this down to, I don't know, like 1.3 or something like that. We also have other cool settings like dispersion coefficient, which can add sort of colors to the refractions as light bounces around off the surface and within the surface. And then we can get into more advanced settings like mediums to create subsurface quality and so on. It's a very advanced material, and you can spend a lot of time creating some really cool effects with it. But even with just a few manipulations, you can see we get a very cool kind of frosted plastic look. So let's take a look at the diffuse material. I'm going to drag a wire from diffuse material into material out. So this is great for rough surfaces. Let's create a different color for the surface here. Let's make this sort of a dull green. Actually, let's have more fun. We got all these nice textures in here. Let's connect the dirty metal texture to the diffuse. And we get this kind of quality. It'd be nice to have a little kind of greenish tint to that dirty metal, so we can do that several different ways. One way to do that is to simply select the texture, go into the node inspector, and set this from grayscale color to, say, RGB color. And now select kind of a greenish tint. And you can see that's a good way to tint a texture very quickly. Another way to do this would be actually to combine it with a color texture. So let's right-click. I'm going to choose Textures, Mappings, Multiply Texture. And then I'm going to right-click and choose Textures, RGB Color. And let's connect this to one side and the RGB color to another, and then connect this to the diffuse input, and then set our RGB color to, say, green. So now this is kind of working like the multiply blend mode, like you might use a blend mode in Photoshop to combine those two textures. We have other options including add and subtract. And of course, a wide variety of both procedural textures and color correct textures. So there's a lot to explore with all the various different textures that you'll find within Octane. Diffuse materials are also good for creating emissive shaders that actually emit light into the scene. So if I select my diffuse material and go down to emission, I can set this to black body or texture. If I set this to black body, you can see that I can use the color temperature as a way to adjust the color of the light that's emitted into the scene. You can see the light is currently coming out sort of unevenly. If I turn on surface brightness, that kind of fixes that problem. The other thing I want to do is let's move this out of the way for a second and just change the view so that we can actually see the ground. And I'm going to select the light and rotate it so that we get something that's a little bit more nighttime. Now our robot is glowing with energy and it's actually emitting light into the scene. So let's set the emission from black body to texture emission. And under texture, instead of a color, I'm going to set this to dirt texture. This is kind of like an ambient occlusion type texture. It's a little bit bright here. So I'm going to bring the power down, and you can start to see the effect of the dirt texture as parts of the surface that are kind of in the nooks and crannies are a little bit darker than those that are exposed. And if I go down here, if I expand texture, I can see here are the settings for that dirt texture. So I can increase or decrease the radius, change the amount of detail, and also the strength. And I'm going to bring the power back up here a little bit. Perhaps too much. Find a happy medium, something like that. So you get kind of a cool effect there. And then finally, I want to kind of take a look at the mix material. So let's disconnect the diffuse material, connect the mixed material. Of course, we need to go back into Unity here and rotate the light so we can actually see something. And let's take a nice view of his face. He's a very handsome robot, so we want to see his face up close. And then go back into the node editor. And let's take our diffuse material, push it to one side, and I'm going to connect a wire from the specular material to one part of the mixed material. Let's see, this is the one that looks like, yes, looks kind of like frosted glass here, so we'll connect that. And then we'll connect the other glossy material here. And then what we can do is we could take the mixed material node and use this amount slider to determine how the two materials are blended together. So if we have put it all on one side, we're going to get only our glossy material. If we put it on the other, we'll get more of that specular material, and then everything in between. And of course, we can also use a texture to determine how they're blended together. So for example, for the amount, instead of just a grayscale color, we could set this to say something like fall off. This will probably look kind of weird, but possibly interesting. So fall off is basically going to use the facing ratio to determine the blending of the material. So we can use the fall off skew factor to kind of determine that angle or the strength of that fall off. And then we also have our minimum values of 0 and 1. So you can see we can manipulate these and sort of tune how the materials are blended together. It can actually get quite sophisticated as well. And you can also nest mixed materials. So I could plug in another mixed material into one of these inputs and another one and another one, so that you have a very complex tree made up of a bunch of different mixed materials. So there's a lot of possibilities there for some real interesting creative exploration. Let's go back into Unity here, and then we can see our handiwork from various different views. If you're moving around in the scene here and you see a little bit of blurring, that's because the autofocus feature is turned on. So just very quickly, I'll select my PBR render target, go into the camera settings and find aperture and set this to 0. And then we don't have that blurring going on. There we go. That's kind of a fun look for our robot. So lots more to explore using the Octane integration into Unity and the Nodegraph editor. Thanks again for watching.